The historical figure recognized as Marie Antoinette was born at the Hofburg Palace in Vienna on November 2, 1755. Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Holy Roman Emperor Francis I bestowed upon her the appellation Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna. As the second to last of 16 children, of which only 10 would reach maturity, her arrival was met with approval but not intensely commemorated. Madame Antoine, and occasionally Antoinette, were appellations used within the family of the 15th child of the Emperor and Empress of Austria, Maria, due to the fact that each of her sisters and mother were also named Maria. Notwithstanding her distinguished Habsburg ancestry, few individuals, including her parents, foresaw that her life or experiences would have such a profound impact. Without a doubt, she was second only to her mother, whose prowess, intellect, and adeptness in diplomacy and statecraft had elevated her to the status of one of Europe's most illustrious monarchs in history. It is highly improbable that any individual could have foreseen Madame Antoine, the youngest Archduchess of Austria, would achieve such prominence or become one of the most renowned, yet notorious, women in history. Antoine's birth occurred in Europe amid a time of significant geopolitical and diplomatic tension. Austria had reclaimed the majority of the territories that it had lost or challenged during the War of Austrian Succession a decade prior, with the exception of Silesia, which was still under the control of Frederick the Great of Prussia, an enduring adversary of Maria Theresa. Following Prussia's ratification of a treaty with England, which was France's principal adversary in Europe and the overseas colonial sphere, Austria promptly considered France as a prospective ally, notwithstanding the protracted animosity that had existed between the two nations throughout history. Her parents solidified their new alliance with King Louis XV of France when Antoine was 6 months old by proposing to her to Louis Auguste, Duc de Berry, the king's grandson. Duc de Berry was a year older than Antoine. The union, which was not formally sanctioned until the two offspring reached the ages of 12 and 13, respectively, would significantly contribute to a sequence of predicaments that incited revolution and conflict, not only in France but across the entirety of Europe. Antoine was born on what various Catholic traditions refer to as All Souls' Day or the Day of the Dead. Due to the association of All Saints' Day with mortality and mourning, the Austrian royal family always celebrated Antoine's birthday the day before, on All Saints' Day. Her birth occurred on an unlucky day, as a catastrophic earthquake struck Lisbon, Portugal, that very same day, resulting in irreparable damage and 30,000 fatalities. Antoine had requested the services of the King and Queen of Portugal as godparents. However, they were compelled to evacuate their devastated capital. Years passed without these coincidences being genuinely observed or commented upon. Due to the communication limitations of the era, information of the catastrophe did not reach Vienna for weeks. Furthermore, the Portuguese king and queen were not anticipated to attend Antoine's christening, as royal godparents were almost always substituted and baptisms were customarily conducted within 3 days of the infant's birth. However, in the centuries and decades that passed after Marie Antoinette's death, it is reasonable to speculate that an ominous aura surrounded her birth, particularly in light of her tragic demise and subsequent life circumstances. A misfortune appeared to befall the young royalty from the outset. Although not extensively documented, Antoine appears to have had a relatively joyful childhood despite her obscure position in her family. Although her eldest siblings were close to 2 decades her junior, 5 of them shared the age in which she could function as playmates and classroom companions. Although Antoine cherished all of her siblings, she was particularly devoted to her 3-year-old sister Charlotte. In addition, notwithstanding their enormous age difference, she maintained a robust bond with her eldest brother Joseph, who would later become the Holy Roman Emperor. It appeared that Maria Theresa's children regarded her with both adoration and trepidation. She was devoted to her family, cherished her children, and approached her motherly duties with great seriousness. However, in addition to these responsibilities, she was also entrusted with the stewardship of an empire as Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary and Bohemia. In 1713, Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, the father of Maria Theresa, established a unique international accord called the Pragmatic Sanction. This treaty acknowledged his eldest daughter as his successor in the event that he failed to produce a son. He then orchestrated the marriage of Maria Theresa to Francis Stephen, the former Duke of Lorraine. Maria Theresa acquiesced to the hereditary rule of Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary following the death of Charles VI, while simultaneously ensuring that her new spouse was elected to the Holy Roman Emperor, a position that was previously reserved for men. However, the Empress herself held the majority of responsibilities and exerted the true authority. Reportedly, Maria Theresa continued to read and approve significant state documents while in her childbearing bed out of such a strong sense of duty and abhorrence for wasting time. Even with her closest companions, historians have noted that the Empress's immense responsibilities imbued her with a stern and harsh disposition, contrary to her professed preference for a close-knit family unit. Additionally, she consistently expressed disapproval towards her children, with a particular emphasis on ensuring that their matrimonial arrangements served the Austrian Empire to the utmost extent feasible. Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nuba, the Latin motto of the Austrian Habsburgs, translates to, allow others to wage war. You, joyful Austria, wed. In order to preserve the dynasty, almost none of Maria Theresa's children were allowed to select their own spouses. Instead, they were all obligated to enter into matrimony. Maria Carolina and Maria Amalia, both referred to as Charlotte within the family, were obligated to wed royal candidates of questionable integrity or capability in service of Austria. The Empress Maria Theresa wrote on the eve of Charlotte's nuptials to the mentally unstable King of Naples, "I will be content with her lack of happiness so long as she earns salvation and fulfills her duty to God and her husband." Even Maria Christina, the preferred daughter of Charlotte's mother, was compelled to concede to the more difficult attributes attributed to Maria Theresa. A few years subsequent to her mother's demise, she composed, "You are aware of the way in which she cherished her pupils. Her affection was perpetually tinged with skepticism and a palpable coldness. Regarding young Antoine, similar to the majority of her siblings, her affection for her mother was perpetually complicated by the Empress's disapproval and her overall negative assessment of Antoine's demeanor, intellect, and aptitudes. With her father, the little Archduchess had a much closer and warmer bond. Francis I and his wife shared few commonalities. Her diligent work ethic stood in stark contrast to his evident quest for enjoyment, and he appeared to be preoccupied with pastimes such as mistresses, gambling, and hunting rather than ruling. Nevertheless, Francis appeared content with his primarily ceremonial role, and although Maria Theresa possessed the actual authority of the state, she heavily depended on Francis to oversee the financial matters of Austria. Given the economic instability that plagued numerous sovereign treasuries in Europe from the mid to late 18th century, Francis managed to acquit himself admirably in these responsibilities. The most regrettable circumstance surrounding the union of Francis and Maria Theresa was her presumption that her affection for him exceeded his for her own. At the tender age of 14, Francis, the young Duke of Lorraine, was essentially adopted into the Austrian court by Emperor Charles VI in preparation for their matrimonial union with his eldest daughter and heir. Despite the fact that Francis did not reciprocate Maria Theresa's sentiments of love from the outset, he appeared to have a sincere fondness, regard, and preference for her. He was regrettably compulsively unfaithful throughout his marriage, and his wife was distressed by his incurable and frequently indiscreet philandering. Despite this, his family appeared to admire him collectively. When at ease in the company of his children, he was characterized as upbeat, vivacious, playful, and teasing. Antoine, his youngest daughter, received the kind of affection and tenderness that their biological mother rarely bestowed upon her. The Austrian royal family possessed a number of residences and pleasure palaces, but during the colder months they resided predominantly at the Hofburg Palace and in the warmer months at Schönbrunn Palace. These palaces were both official royal residences where diplomatic and political matters were routinely deliberated and authority was duly wielded. Daily, dignitaries such as courtiers, ambassadors, administrators, and others engaged in formal interactions with the royal family at these palaces. Nonetheless, throughout history, both palaces were built and enhanced with the intention of safeguarding a domain of seclusion for the royal family. In contrast to other European monarchs of the mid-18th century, the Austrian Habsburgs upheld a conspicuous division between the personal and public spheres. The French royal family, on the other hand, was visible at all hours of the day. Government ministers and France's highest nobility might even observe their bathing and dressing rituals. Each of these individuals was certain of their absolute entitlement to such access to the royal family. On the contrary, Austrian royal palaces were constructed with considerably more distinct divisions between public chambers designated for official gatherings and audiences, and private chambers that could only be entered upon the royal family's explicit invitation. Antoine and her siblings were consequently raised in an informal, unpretentious family environment, in stark contrast to the regal lifestyles of their European counterparts. It was customary for the offspring of Maria Theresa and Francis I to attend public events in their capacity as regal representatives, but they also enjoyed frequent opportunities for private leisure activities. During the winter, the Austrian Habsburgs engaged in outdoor pursuits such as sledding. During the summer, they went hunting and horseback. Given that Vienna was one of the most culturally affluent cities in Europe, it came as no surprise that the entire family was an art patron and enthusiast. Whether in private for their own amusement or in public for the court's amusement, the royal family especially relished performing amateur theatricals, dancing, and music. Antoine had been exposed to the performances and instruction of some of Europe's preeminent musicians, composers, and performers since a young age. In October 1762, during a performance at Schönbrunn Palace for the royal family, she had the honor of encountering Wolfgang Mozart, a prodigy of 6 years whose age was precisely 2 months younger than her own. Jean-Georges Noverre, a prominent ballet master of the era, instructed her in dance, while Christoph Willibald Gluck, a renowned composer who received the official patronage of Maria Theresa in the same year Antoine was born, instructed her in music. Unsurprisingly, Antoine's education placed significant emphasis on the arts, and she demonstrated remarkable aptitude in various artistic endeavors. Even as an infant, she was a remarkable dancer who was characterized by modern observers as remarkably graceful and composed. Antoine demonstrated his musical prowess as well. It was said that she possessed a beautiful vocal voice and was proficient on the harp and harpsichord. Additionally, by the time she reached adolescence, she had developed into a professional sight reader of music. However, in addition to her renowned artistic achievements, she did not excel academically. Despite her eventual development of an interest in history, she maintained a lack of curiosity in all other scholastic disciplines. Upon Mathieu Jacques, Abbé de Vermond's, 1768, arrival from France to evaluate the princess's prior education and initiate preparations for her role as the Dauphin's wife, she was a mere 12 years old and could hardly write in her native tongue. His arrival was met with astonishment and disbelief. This is unexpected in light of the fact that the Austrian Habsburgs possessed unparalleled access to educational resources in Europe and that a number of Antoine's immediate family members were exceptionally erudite and knowledgeable. Moreover, Vienna emerged as a preeminent metropolis in Europe in terms of intellectualism, refinement, and an inclusive global outlook on education. A considerable portion of the Viennese, as well as some Habsburgs, maintained trilingualism. They frequently used German, the language of their subjects in Italy, Italian, due to their control over multiple regions in Italy, and French, the lingua franca of 18th-century Europe. At the tender age of 13, Antoine acquired proficiency solely in her native tongue, French. Nevertheless, her discourse was heavily influenced by German linguistic features, and she possessed a robust German dialect. There are several plausible factors that could have played a role in her overall lackluster academic performance. The emperor, the father of Antoine, was a former Duke of Lorraine who spoke French as his native tongue. Despite attaining the Emperorcy of Austria, albeit primarily in a ceremonial capacity, He resolutely declined to acquire German and neither speak the language. This behavior potentially impacted his daughter. In addition, some sources claimed that Antoine's principal governess exhibited a notable lack of concern for her young pupil. Reading has never been Antoine's forte, and it is conceivable that she was allowed to disregard those subjects she did not find enjoyable. Moreover, it is possible that Antoine's parents did not place sufficient value on correcting her inadequate education. Prior to the near certainty that she would wed the Dauphin of France, Antoine's education and training appeared to be of little concern to the Austrian court. This may have been due to the fact that until her marriage to the future King of France was secured, no one regarded her as teachably valuable beyond being an ornamental object for the royal court. It is not remarkable that Abbé de Vermond, her tutor, noted that his student exhibited a proclivity for sloth and frivolity, given the lack of structure and consistency in her early education. Nevertheless, he conveyed assurance regarding what he perceived to be her innate intelligence. Notwithstanding her educational deficiencies, Antoine demonstrated remarkable aptitude for learning rapidly. Vermond observed that when she was sufficiently motivated to learn, she rapidly assimilated new information and exhibited commendable use of logic when proposing solutions to problems. Antoine's literacy and learning capacity increased significantly and expeditiously under his guidance. Despite the fact that the Austrian Habsburgs seemed to enjoy an exceptionally fortunate lifestyle, they, being a regal family, were not immune to experiencing tragedy. In the context of 18th-century Europe, the fact that only 3 of 16 children in one family perished in infancy is truly remarkable. An additional pestilence that frequently visited the Austrian royal family was smallpox. 6 members of Antoine's immediate family, including the Empress, contracted the disease at some point between the late 1750s and 1760s. As a consequence, Maria Theresa initiated an inoculation campaign in Vienna, during which Antoine and her younger brother Maximilian were administered the novel technique that entailed the introduction of biological material from individuals afflicted with the virus. Despite the fact that this early vaccine technique was 1,000 times more hazardous than modern methods, both children miraculously survived unscathed. In the 1760s, the smallpox virus claimed the lives of Charles, Maria Johanna, and Maria Josepha, all of whom were elder siblings of Antoine. The family was dealt an additional calamitous setback in August 1765, when Emperor Francis I passed away unexpectedly of a heart attack or stroke. Empress Maria Theresa was anguished and immediately descended into the profound mourning. She remained entirely attired in widow's black throughout her lifetime. Antoine, aged 9, was devastated to the same degree as the rest of the family. According to legend, before his final departure for Innsbruck, he bade his family adieu, but unexpectedly returned to reunite with his youngest daughter. Francis I passed away in his conveyance en route home from the opera mere days later. By way of a memorandum to his will, he cautioned his children against placing undue confidence in others and advised them to be circumspect in their choice of companions. He advised them to refrain from engaging in wagering and other irresponsible activities. Young Antoine may have benefited from all of this advice in retrospect, and numerous historical commentators have criticized her for appearing to have disregarded it in the years that followed. A 14-year-old Antoine bid adieu to her family, friends, and nation in April 1770, filled with anxiety. Her mother advised her to acclimatize herself to her new spouse and his family, and to gain the favor of the French court by utilizing all of her charisma and affability. "Be so beneficent to the French people that they may say I sent him an angel," she penned. In Compiègne, close to the Austrian frontier with France, where Antoine's carriage was stationed, King Louis XV and her fiancé, the Dauphin Louis, encountered Antoine. Prior to being introduced to her new family, Antoine underwent a ceremonial and entirely symbolic altercation of dress. Antoine's attendants assisted her in relinquishing all of her Austrian clothing and jewelry on an island in the Rhine River, which served as the traditional border between France and Austria. In their place, they attired her in French garments and jewels, Notwithstanding the fact that her previous grand court costume was also fashioned in the French style, the prevailing fashion in Europe. Madame Antoine Maria Antonia, the Habsburg Princess of Austria, had passed away. She was to henceforth referred to as Madame la Dauphine, Marie Antoinette, a princess of France. She shed tears as her Austrian attendants bid her departure, overcome with apprehension and instant homesickness. However, she managed to regain her composure in time to be formally introduced to King Louis and her fiancé, the Dauphin. Joseph, the eldest brother of Maria Theresa and Antoine, the newly crowned Holy Roman Emperor, had deeply imparted upon her the significance of Austria's alliance with France. The realization that she bore the responsibility for fostering the precarious new alliance must have been extremely intimidating. Marie Antoinette and Louis Auguste de Bourbon exchanged vows in the regal chapel situated at Versailles on May 18, 1770. Even more so than his fiancé, Louis, who was only 15 years old at the time, was anxious. Critics noted that he maintained a rigid posture during the entire ceremony and experienced hand tremors while affixing the ring to his bridegroom. Their apprehension was regrettably warranted. Their initial years of matrimony would be tumultuous and challenging, resulting in an enduring effect on the public personas. Marie Antoinette was initially mesmerized by the splendor and grandeur of the French court. Versailles had emerged as the preeminent model for European palaces, and other European monarchs perpetually endeavored to emulate it. Although Schönbrunn Palace, situated in Antoine's birthplace of Vienna, was designed to resemble a miniature Versailles, the princess was nonetheless captivated by the original's grandeur and immaculate craftsmanship. Having swiftly grasped the significance of fashion, aesthetic appeal, refinement, wit, and charisma in garnering the esteem of the French aristocracy and royal court, she resolved to be the most fashionable, alluring, and in-demand woman in France. At Versailles, Marie Antoinette was initially quite successful. King Louis XV was immediately captivated by her amiable demeanor, exuberant spirit, and extraordinary musical prowess. The Dauphine's initial experiences at the French court were fruitful due to the king's favor, and it is possible that specific criticisms of the young princess were temporarily restrained by King Louis' favor. Notwithstanding the esteem that her youthful vitality and aesthetic appeal evoked, she remained a juvenile adolescent unprepared for the role in which she was promptly anticipated to excel. She mismanaged relationships with several influential political figures at court, including les tantes, the king's elderly sisters who regarded themselves as conduct arbiters at the French court, as might have been the case with many 14-year-olds. Marie Antoinette was profoundly disturbed by the complete absence of seclusion that accompanied her status as a French royal family member. Due to her upbringing in which a clear demarcation was made between public, political spheres and private, family-only areas, she was astounded to discover that she was rarely permitted to be alone or perform even the most trivial personal duties for herself. Her opposition to royal protocol and occasional open ridicule of it caused the elderly great-aunts of her spouse to dislike her. Furthermore, she successfully estranged courtiers from influential aristocratic lineages by substituting younger, more animated individuals for them in her domestic service, an action that she found more appealing. During her first few months at Versailles, Marie Antoinette also made an enemy of Madame du Barry, the king's official mistress, whom she refused to even acknowledge respectfully. Furthermore, the majority of King Louis' advisers were opposed to an Austrian challenge for the Dauphin and had a general mistrust of the princess. A group at Versailles, concerned about the potential sway she might have over the Dauphin on behalf of Austria, derisively dubbed her the Austrian. Regrettably, this mistrust of both the Austrian alliance and Marie Antoinette's new spouse, which had been deeply ingrained in his upbringing by his tutors, further complicated an already tumultuous union between two immature adolescents and his prospective spouse. Marie Antoinette and Louis Auguste de Bourbon were as dissimilar to each other as two individuals could possibly be. Their only similarity was that they both had blue eyes. Her ash-blonde hair was a slight tint darker than his, but that was about it. He was timid and uncomfortable, whereas she was outgoing and animated. In contrast to his indecisiveness, she was resolute and moved swiftly into action. He delighted in reading, an activity she had never taken pleasure in before. Even his enormous stature stood in stark contrast to her diminutive build, as Louis, who was 6 feet 4 inches tall, was quite towering for France in the 18th century. While acknowledging in private that he did find his wife attractive and eventually developed feelings for her, he maintained an unwavering refusal to consummate the marriage. This refusal persisted for the initial 7 years of their union. A premature absence of consummation is to be expected, given that the bride and groom, who were precisely 14 and 15 years old, respectively, were in their adolescence. Due to the rarity of sexual discussions, even among family members, the young couple likely did not know what to do when they were left alone on their wedding night. Having only become acquainted a few days prior, they were almost certainly extremely anxious. According to the entries in Louis' diary, he retired to slumber on the evening of his wedding and for the 2 nights that followed. As Versailles, particularly for the royal family, is the least private location in all of France, the absence of consummation between the Dauphin and the Dauphine was promptly disclosed to the public. The absence of a consummated union precluded the establishment of any potential royal progeny or successors to ensure the continuity of the French throne. Due to the critical nature of the situation, courtiers promptly apprised King Louis XV of the development. The monarch, who had a soft spot for both his grandchild and granddaughter-in-law, appeared to demonstrate some comprehension. He firmly opposed any efforts to escalate the matter to the Dauphin and conveyed optimism that the young couple would eventually become acclimated to their matrimonial union. In contrast, Empress Maria Theresa exhibited considerably less tolerance towards her daughter's perceived errors and deficiencies. The correspondence between Marie Antoinette and Maria Theresa during the latter's first several years at Versailles serves as a poignant illustration of the arduous nature of the mother-daughter bond. The Empress, supported by agents stationed at Versailles, consistently berated Antoine for alienating members of the French court, for her extravagant and superfluous lifestyle, and above all, for his inability to convince or entice her husband to consummate the marriage. Maria Theresa reprimanded her daughter for permitting her frivolity and flightiness to earn her the attention of French tabloid rumor. The Empress reprimanded Antoine for neglecting to engage in self-improvement, advised her to increase her reading, and cautioned her that her intellect, talent, culture, and character were insufficient to endure the considerably more severe criticism that she anticipated would inevitably ensue. Marie Antoinette frequently reacted defensively to these letters, assuring Maria Theresa that she had the utmost regard for the alliance of France and Austria, and expressing regret and anguish that her mother should have the worst opinion of her. It did not take Marie Antoinette long to earn a reputation for frivolous extravagance, as her mother had predicted. Historiographers and biographers have postulated that a portion of her extravagant and indulgent preferences, which she cultivated during the early years of her matrimonial tenure, particularly subsequent to her accession to the throne, constituted an endeavor to offset her discontent. She not only continued to experience physical unhappiness but also maintained an emotional distance from her husband, who harbored a skepticism towards his wife and skepticism regarding her Austrian allegiances for an extended period of time. At the age of 64, on May 11, 1774, King Louis XV passed away from smallpox in his bed at Versailles. In his final years of reign, he was profoundly unpopular, and it appeared that only his grandson genuinely lamented his passing. The French populace now regarded Louis XVI with optimism and hope. The nascent monarch, who was only 19 years old, lacked the charismatic demeanor and authoritative stature of his predecessors, Louis XV and Louis XIV, but was regarded as an affable, sincere, intelligent, and conscientious youth. These were all commendable attributes for a prospective monarch who might be both great and impartial. Initially, Queen Marie Antoinette enjoyed considerable favor with the French people due to her attractiveness, sense of style, and charisma. However, 4 more years elapsed before the royal marriage was consummated. Furthermore, As time passed without any changes being implemented, the public perception of the monarch and queen deteriorated further. As spouses, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette became even more estranged following their accession to the monarchy of France. Louis awoke early, completed his daily responsibilities, and retired to bed early. In contrast, Antoine enjoyed staying up late and seldom awoke before 10 or 11 in the morning. He preferred hunting, reading, and cycling, and was typically reserved and soft-spoken in social situations. She delighted in the merriment and diversion that evenings in Paris provided, such as witnessing the opera, the theatre, or masked balls. She indulged frivolously in exquisite apparel and jewelry, donning hairstyles that could reach a height of 3 feet and were frequently adorned with voluminous netting and feather plumes. She was an avid gambler who frequently suffered enormous losses at the gaming tables in Paris. Due to this conduct, she acquired the extremely unfavorable moniker Madame Deficit from the French populace, who grew ever more certain that her extravagant spending was the primary cause of France's economic woes. Louis may have been mitigating for loneliness and dissatisfaction in her marriage, if not for the same reasons Marie Antoinette did. Following his accession to the throne, Louis bestowed upon his spouse La Petite Trianon an estate situated within the premises of Versailles, which had previously been the property of Madame de Pompadour, the official concubine of Louis XV. Louis, aware that Marie Antoinette found the complete absence of privacy at Versailles to be tedious and confining, bequeathed the estate to her as a private sanctuary. She was free to invite only those she deemed suitable, and she had complete authority over the renovation and improvement of the house and grounds. The king also routinely and discreetly repaid his wife's substantial debts without reprimand. Louis' extraordinary capitulation to his queen's every whim might have been influenced, in part, by a feeling of remorse. Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, the eldest brother of Antoine, traveled to France covertly and unofficially on his mother's behalf during the summer of 1777. His purpose was to assess the state of the French-Austrian alliance and, more specifically, the troublesome marriage of his sister. It appears that Louis and Joseph got along so well that Louis confided in Joseph regarding his erotic issues. Historiographers have long hypothesized that Louis XVI may have suffered from phimosis or another physical condition that caused unpleasantness or discomfort during sexual activity. In general, contemporary historians deny the hypothesis that the king underwent circumcision as a means to treat this condition. Conversely, they highlight the correspondence between Joseph II and his mother and brother Leopold, which suggests that Louis suffered from psychological barriers to his sexuality. These barriers likely stemmed from his profound apprehension or dread of engaging in sexual activity, as well as his embarrassment over his lack of experience and knowledge. Anxiety, resentment, and a marked decrease in Antoine's willingness to attempt supportive persuasion were all side effects of her husband's reluctance in the marital bed. In the end, Joseph's visit and interventions between the French monarchs and queen did, so to say, produce results. Marie Antoinette delightedly informed her mother in a letter a few weeks subsequent to his departure for Vienna that her marriage had been consummated, finally and perfectly, after a duration of 7 years. She wrote, "I do not believe I am pregnant at this time, but I do have a strong desire to become so in the near future." The Queen was correct. Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child the following year. On December 19, 1778, she named her daughter Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, in honor of her mother and her preferred sister. The progress they had made in their marriage and the delivery of a child contributed to the king and queen developing a closer, more trustworthy bond. And for a time, despite the fact that their first child was not a son, the royal family experienced a surge in popularity. The arrival of a daughter suggested that France might soon have a dauphin as well. Prior to the mid to late 18th century, these developments may have sufficed to increase political stability and decrease monarchical criticism. However, France was undergoing profound social, political, and ideological transformations at that time, teetering on the precipice of a new world whose values were diametrically opposed to the traditional images and prerogatives of royalty. Both Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were brought up in the privileged environment of European royalty. They were virtually oblivious to the profound fissures that were beginning to form in the foundation of French society and were unaware of how the citizens of their respective nations lived. Due primarily to the expenses of war, France's rigidly hierarchical and profoundly unequal social system was subjected to intense economic pressure from the middle to the end of the 18th century. In an effort to undermine Britain, France's conflicts with its European neighbors in the preceding decades and Louis XVI's lavish support of the American Revolution had brought the French treasury perilously close to insolvency. Simultaneously, the French populace endured intermittent periods of hunger as a result of successively subpar harvests. As incensed and destitute individuals struggled to shelter and feed their families, persistently high food prices and taxes sparked alarming episodes of civil unrest. Furthermore, alongside these significant structural challenges, the tenets of the Enlightenment had started to extensively infiltrate French society, inspiring working-class individuals, numerous bourgeoisie members, and certain aristocrats to develop republican sympathies. Philosophes and revolutionaries, motivated by the American Revolution and the growing recognition of the importance of government accountability, the eradication of noble privilege, and the inherent rights of every individual, presented a formidable challenge to the French monarchy's authority and legitimacy during its most vulnerable period. During the 1780s, Marie Antoinette gave birth to 3 more children. Louis-Joseph Xavier François, a dauphin for France, was born in December 1781, Marie-Sophie Hélène Béatrix was born in July 1786, and Louis Charles was born in March 1785. Notwithstanding the outward appearance of enhanced domesticity and stability within the royal family, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's public personas continued to deteriorate. The protracted duration of their matrimonial union had a detrimental effect on the public's opinion of both the monarch and the queen. Louis was considered feeble and ineffectual, and his sexual deficiencies were correlated with an incapacity to govern with proficiency. It was believed that the queen was tyrannical, avaricious, and exploitative of her husband's frailty. Louis XVI was occasionally portrayed in the scurrilous libels, or scandal papers that circulated across France, as a castrated pig sporting a dumb and slothful grin. The tabloids frequently derided Marie Antoinette for her extravagant lifestyle and the alleged attempt to exert political influence over her husband on behalf of Austria. Beyond this, however, the public criticisms directed at the Queen in the libels tended to be sexual in nature, and as France approached the revolutionary watershed in 1789, they grew darker, more explicit, and more menacing. As the years passed without consummation of her marriage approached, speculations began to propagate that she had been involved with a significant number of lovers, if not an infinite number. Some historians now believe there is sufficient evidence to affirm that Marie Antoinette had at least one intimate love affair during her marriage, with the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, despite the fact that this is extremely improbable. After his triumph over the British during the American Revolution, the Count, an attractive and dashing adventurer, established himself as Marie Antoinette's closest advisor and friend. During the 1780s, Fersen frequented Le Petit Trianon, and the Queen granted him the bedroom immediately above hers. It is noteworthy to mention that her spouse, Louis XVI, reportedly never stayed the night at Le Petit Trianon, although he would spend the odd day there with his family at the request of his wife. Historiographers have historically refrained from forming definitive opinions regarding the nature of Count Fersen and Marie Antoinette's relationship on account of the substantial volume of their correspondence having been misplaced, deliberately destroyed, or substantially redacted subsequently. In 2016, however, historians working in the archives of France and Sweden asserted that they had discovered and deciphered numerous letters confirming that Fersen and the Queen had been profoundly in love and intimately involved for many years. Due to the pre-existing public tarnishment on her moral integrity, the Queen's reputation was not remedied by her motherhood. Her detractors immediately asserted that the king was not the father of any of her offspring, including the Dauphin. Despite the fact that Marie Antoinette intended Le Petit Trianon as a refuge from the court, she likely was unaware that her actions there significantly damaged her reputation. Historically, French monarchs were not granted privacy, as any attempt to do so would have led the general populace to suspect that the monarch herself had something to conceal. Sexual immorality was the most frequently envisioned vice. Nonetheless, the manner in which the Queen renovated the estate was also contentious. In an effort to establish a rustic agricultural retreat on the estate, she incurred extravagant expenditures, even employing a peasant family to care for the livestock and generate sustenance. In the interim, she, her companions, and her children, all attired in plain white muslin, enjoyed excursions and performed in amateur theatricals alongside her, assuming the roles of shepherdesses and milkmaids. The notion of the Queen lavishing enormous sums of money while feigning poverty as the actual peasants at the base of France's social hierarchy starved appeared to be an illustration of callous ignorance and contempt for all but regal whim and consequence. Before it was too late, Marie Antoinette probably never considered how her actions appeared to others. After the birth of her children, Marie Antoinette initiated a process of social withdrawal, which failed to significantly ameliorate the profoundly unfavorable public perception that had marked her initial years as Dauphine and Queen of France. Her involvement and interest in politics grew, and Louis appeared to be more receptive to her counsel, especially concerning military and bureaucratic appointments. However, her propensity to mediate on behalf of Austria failed to gain the favor of those at court who had perpetually harbored skepticism towards the Austrian alliance. Furthermore, her presence in Parisian ballrooms and gaming tables had significantly diminished, and she had adopted a more conservative stance regarding her fashion selections and her requests to the treasury. However, many of these endeavors were premature in nature. A convergence of economic and public relations catastrophes occurred between 1787 and 1789, bringing the oldest monarchy in Europe, France's, to the verge of collapse. In 1787, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI endured a challenging period as their infant daughter, Madame Sophie, died of tuberculosis at the tender age of 11 months. A few months later, while the Queen was still grieving the loss of her daughter, the Parisian jewelers Baume and Bassange presented her with an opportunity to acquire an exquisite diamond necklace that had been custom crafted for Madame du Barry, the concubine of Louis XV. It possessed an astounding 647 brilliantly cut and faceted diamonds and was estimated to be worth around €7 million, equivalent to $8 million in present-day currency. While admiring the necklace, the Queen declined to purchase it immediately. A gullible aristocratic cardinal was duped by a group of criminals who devised a scheme to steal the necklace into believing that Marie Antoinette instructed him to discreetly purchase the necklace for her with the promise of reimbursement later. In an effort to gain grace with the Queen, the cardinal consented eagerly. The King and Queen were enraged when the payment became due. The necklace, which two of the criminals had absconded with, was never returned to Marie Antoinette. Louis XVI issued an arrest warrant for the cardinal on suspicion of being a co-conspirator. Given that the cardinal was a member of one of the most influential noble families in France, it is unsurprising that the overwhelmingly aristocratic parliament of judges acquitted him of all charges. Anne Antoinette was in anguish. The acquittal of the cardinal suggested that the Queen must have been culpable for the theft due to her desire for the necklace. In fact, the scandal referred to as the Affaire de Collier de la Reine, or the affair of the Queen's necklace, primarily damaged her reputation. The deterioration of Louis XVI's mental and physical health commenced between 1787 and 1789. He coped with tension through excessive drinking and overeating. He experienced an increasing number of episodes of debilitating depression. Marie Antoinette became more directly involved in French politics and wielded more authority than ever before due to exigent circumstances. She began attending King's Council meetings as her husband approached a nervous collapse. During these sessions, Louis' chief ministers grappled with the economic crisis that was posing a threat of France's bankruptcy. She was regrettably unprepared to assume such a position and possessed limited knowledge of economics and politics. Nevertheless, her conduct reveals a resolute commitment to preserving the unity of her family and the French monarchy. Having been raised by a mother who served as a role model, Marie Antoinette may have felt compelled to perform at the highest level possible. She played a pivotal role in the selection and removal of multiple finance ministers, all of whom were unable to devise a viable solution to the debt crisis that was progressively engulfing the nation for diverse motives. Despite endeavors to garner the support of France's nobility, their reluctance to relinquish their trade monopolies or tax exemptions in order to aid in the economic recovery proved insufficient. In desperation, the king finally convened a meeting of the Estates General, which was France's closest approximation to a national legislature or parliament in history. The summons of the Estates General by Louis was completely out of the ordinary. Since 1614, there had been no gathering of representatives from the three estates of French society: the clergy, the nobility, and the common people. Nothing was achieved during the Estates General proceedings due to the fact that all participants were pursuing wildly divergent objectives. The Third Estate, which comprised the vast majority of the French populace, espoused the notion of establishing a constitutional French republic. In contrast, both Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were inconceivable of relinquishing power to elected politicians. Many citizens demanded solutions to France's bread crisis, which was starving the urban and rural poor equally, whereas the conservative nobility defended their traditional privileges. No progress was made during the discussions. On June 4, 1789, 1 month following the inauguration of the Estates General, Dauphin, who was 7 years old at the time, succumbed to tuberculosis. Little public discourse or recognition of the royal family's demise ensued, as the entirety of France was engrossed in the forthcoming Estates General meeting. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were both devastated. A few days later, the Queen composed, "My poor little boy has died," and the nation hardly seemed to notice. On June 20, while the King and Queen were still in mourning for their son, Third Estate representatives arrived at Versailles to find the door to their meeting chamber locked. They assumed that the King had issued an order for their expulsion and instead relocated to a nearby tennis court, where they proclaimed themselves the National Assembly of France and swore to remain in session until they had drafted a constitution. Immediately after its formation, the National Assembly proceeded to propose, debate, and implement reforms. Concerned by the unapproved progression of these events, Marie Antoinette persuaded the king to relocate a Swiss military contingent in closer proximity to Paris. As a result, the city was engulfed in rioting, with citizens terrified that their own government would launch an assault against them and the National Assembly's ongoing reforms. The outburst of ire that erupted on July 14 led to the besiege of the Bastille, an ancient fortress, the execution of its governor, and the seizure of its arsenal and prisoners. Paris was engulfed in violence and anarchy. The king was unexpectedly awoken at Versailles at 2 o'clock in the morning and apprised that the Bastille had been seized. "Is a revolt occurring?" the king inquired. "No, sir," was the response. "It is a revolution." Royal authority rapidly disintegrated following the collapse of the Bastille. Aristocrats throughout the nation developed a great fear that additional popular uprisings were imminent, and many began to discreetly withdraw from France. In the days that followed, the majority of the extended royal family and numerous high-ranking courtiers left Versailles. Louis XVI's unequivocal refusal to depart prompted Marie Antoinette to remain by the side of her spouse and children, despite the fact that she had previously held a firm conviction in opposition to the idea. As the months passed, the pace of events accelerated. While the National Assembly laboriously attempted to implement their recently ratified constitution and reforms, the far more critical issue of food insecurity wreaked havoc throughout France. As of October 5, there were reports circulating in Paris regarding the organization of an elaborate banquet at Versailles for the most distinguished members of the Swiss Guard under the king. The women in the city's street markets were enraged. Why should there be festivities and plenty at Versailles when bread remained unaffordable for the majority of Parisians and their children went hungry? Protesting Versailles with clubs, pitchforks, blades, and anything else they could obtain, several hundred women were armed and demanded bread. Later in the day, they were accompanied by a multitude of additional males and females, and as a result, they overpowered the palace soldiers. Marie Antoinette's bedroom was directly targeted by a mob that tormented Versailles, resulting in the deaths of 2 of her guardians. Merely seconds before they stormed in, she detected their approach and escaped to the bedroom of her spouse through a concealed entrance. Furious at discovering her absence, the rabble tore the Queen's bed to shreds. At the helm of the National Guard, the Marquis de Lafayette arrived just in time to restore order at Versailles. Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI, and their 2 children departed the palace that evening, never to return. They were accompanied by mob members and National Guard personnel to the Tuileries Palace, situated in the heart of Paris, for the purpose of heightened surveillance and protection. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were both adversely affected by the immense duress that the royal family was presently experiencing. While Louis's melancholy and indecision deepened, his wife became more determined than ever before to take action. Over the subsequent 2 years, the Queen underwent an extraordinary process of maturation and education. She realized that, if at all possible, it was now her responsibility to maintain monarchical stability. Following her son's passing a few months prior, she appeared to have developed overnight. Furthermore, she would engage in the perilous game of double agent in the months that followed. She exerted considerable influence over French policy by collaborating closely with members of the legislative and constituent assemblies, as well as the National Assembly. Marie Antoinette's intervention was predominantly responsible for Louis XVI's continued authority to proclamate war and veto legislation. Although she regarded the emerging political power brokers in France as a pack of lunatics, she made an effort to collaborate with Republicans such as the Comte de Mirabeau, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, the mayor of Paris, and the Marquis de Lafayette, whom she abhorred just as much as he despised her. However, while working alongside the revolution's leaders and earning their admiration for her resolve, valor, shrewdness, and propriety, she also remained awake throughout the night, clandestinely composing encrypted correspondences to monarchist allies across Europe, with a particular focus on her family in Austria. She discreetly updated these individuals on the latest developments in France. Her ultimate intentions remain uncertain at this time. However, she seemed resolute in her efforts to maintain potential escape routes open and possibly instill the possibility of reclaiming France from the revolutionaries in the future. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI might have had the capacity to confront the complexities of a constitutional monarchy. However, their ability to intervene significantly in the profound divisions that were emerging among revolutionary leaders and the French people as a whole was limited. Many individuals were no longer satisfied with the constitutional monarchy and the abolition of noble and clerical privilege. Rather, they advocated for the complete abolition of both the monarchy and the church. Following the demise of Mirabeau, her most trusted ally among the revolutionary leaders, Marie Antoinette began to more seriously consider the possibility of fleeing France. Daily, the revolution became increasingly radical. The Queen was successful in persuading her spouse to depart prior to further limitations on their freedom of movement, which would have rendered escape unattainable. On June 14, 1791, during the wee hours of the night, members of the royal family crept discreetly into a carriage parked in front of the Tuileries Palace. In less than an hour, they had fled Paris and were en route to the Austrian frontier in a carriage driven by Count Axel Fersen, who had assisted Marie Antoinette in coordinating their escape. After reaching a sufficient distance from Paris, Louis issued a directive for the Count to depart, purportedly to avoid appearing to have accepted the aid of an outsider in their attempt to escape France. However, for his own peace of mind, he was equally likely anxious to send his wife's lover away. The royal household arrived in Varennes, where the local postmaster acknowledged Louis, who had only momentarily exited the carriage. The man had, incredulously, only ever observed the visage of the king on his coinage. The fact that Louis was identified is evidence of the shoddy execution of the escape. Their carriage, clothing, and luggage were excessively opulent and pricey, and to make matters worse, the king's royal regalia and crown were discovered in their possessions during a search. The royal family, who were now regarded as true prisoners and reviled by their own people for allegedly supplying Austrian armies with materials to invade France, were escorted back to Paris by the National Guard. Afraid of being executed by General Lafayette, the crowds encircling their carriage were eerily mute as they beheld the king and queen pass with hostile, accusatory gazes. The subsequent year witnessed an even more radical revolution due to the Jacobins' ascent to power. Marie Antoinette endeavored one last time to advance the cause of the constitutional monarchy, most notably by forging a policy collaboration and correspondence with Antoine Barnave, who was arguably the most moderate and influential member of the Constituent Assembly at the time. France, on the other hand, had declared war on Austria by April. Summertime in Paris was marked by an increasingly tense and combative atmosphere. A threat of an Austrian invasion to reinstate the monarchy prompted an assault on the Palace of Tuileries. By September, the monarchy had been abolished by the Assembly. A few weeks later, all royalists, putative sympathizers, and counter-revolutionaries who were being detained in the jails of Paris were subjected to a citywide massacre. The royal family was relocated to quarters in the fortress known as the Temple that were significantly more secure and heavily guarded. A few months of tranquility prevailed for the family, but in December, citizen Louis Capet, formerly Louis XVI, was indicted for treason. In January 1793, he was sentenced to death by guillotine after being proved guilty. He was allowed to bid his family a private farewell before proceeding with his execution the following day with poise and silent bravery. Marie Antoinette grew even more devoted to her children after the death of her spouse, but within a few months, both her eldest daughter Marie-Thérèse and her son Louis-Charles were taken from her. The Dauphin was perceived as a formidable adversary, a possible king-in-waiting. The prince, who was 7 years old at the time, was subjected to abhorrent physical and emotional torture at the hands of his captors, who made every effort to introduce him to the principles of the revolution. Eventually, the daughter of Marie Antoinette would flee to Austria, whereas Louis-Charles, who was 10 years old at the time, perished in the Temple of Tuberculosis. On the eve of the announcement that Marie Antoinette would be tried for treason, she was transferred to a filthy, gloomy cell in the dilapidated fortress called the Conciergerie, where she was completely destitute. The trial of Marie Antoinette was a complete spectacle. She faced allegations of engaging in a plot with Austria to undermine France, negligently misusing the nation's treasury, and moral and carnal deterioration. Presently, it is understood that the Queen did, in fact, provide Austria and other European allies with intelligence on a regular basis. However, there was no evidence to support this claim at the time of her trial. Due to the absence of substantial evidence, the proceedings devolved into a rehash of all the unfounded allegations that had been circulated regarding her in tabloids throughout the years. Her judges even made an attempt to supplement the list of offenses with an allegation of incest. By some means, Louis-Charles was compelled by his captors to allege that his mother had sexually assaulted him. Marie Antoinette responded stonily when asked why she did not respond to the accusation. "Nature is incapable of answering a charge leveled against a mother. I implore all the mothers in attendance at the court to heed my entreaty in this regard." Amidst a disgraceful and humiliating void, a number of women approached her with expressions of condolence and encouragement. Although the incest charge was not pursued further by the judges, Marie Antoinette was still declared guilty of treason. She responded, when asked if she had anything to say, she stated, "I was a queen when you seized my crown, a mother when you seized my children, and a wife when you seized my spouse. Only my blood remains. Permit it if you will, but do not subject me to undue suffering." Marie Antoinette changed from her sole remaining black gown to a tattered white one delivered to her by her captors on the morning of October 16, 1793. After having her wrists bound behind her, She was escorted from her conciergerie cell to the courtyard, where a diminutive open cart awaited. As it meandered leisurely through the streets of Paris, the assembled masses jeered and hurled profanities at the motionless, white figure. Despite feeling decades older than her actual age of 38, she maintained a dignified countenance, head erect, and expression. Subsequently, journalists who attended the execution of Marie Antoinette wrote that she occupied herself with the unabashed arrogance of the most obstinate criminal. However, had she shed tears, sobbed, and pleaded for her life, it is probable that the same commentators would have criticized her for her cowardice. The Queen passed away with extraordinary bravery. The guillotine awaited Marie Antoinette on a platform in the heart of the Place de la Révolution, surrounded by a throng of people who were vociferously urging her to be executed. She ascended the few steps without hesitation or faltering and stepped on the executioner's foot by accident. Her final words appeared to encompass the entirety of her experiences, beginning with her arrival in France and culminating in this horrifying moment. "I beg your pardon, sir," she whispered. "I did not intentionally do it," she insisted as she knelt before the block. A weapon was lost. An instant of unsettling silence was followed by a resounding roar as the executioner raised the head of the Queen in front of the baying audience. Over a century after her demise, Marie Antoinette's legacy pervaded the realm with its extravagant extravagance, indifferent governance and behavior, and complete indifference to the plight of others. There is some merit to these accusations, particularly when one considers the financial burden that France incurred to maintain the royal family's decadent lifestyle. While acknowledging her numerous errors during her reign as queen, an increasing number of historians have begun to rehabilitate her reputation in recent decades and argue that she did not merit the misfortunes that befell her. She had not received adequate preparation or training to assume the role that was imposed upon her when she was a young child, serving as a mere pawn in her mother's dynastic chessboard. She had fulfilled her societal obligations as Queen of France, but due to her complete isolation from the evolving world beyond Versailles, she was oblivious to the fact that public opinion could now be utilized to her detriment. The scapegoat status she had acquired and the widespread belief that her purported avarice, sexual avarice, and control over her spouse were the sole causes of the king's weakness, his reluctance to support the revolution, and France's downfall were indicative of the profound and sinister misogyny that saturated French society. Despite the profound sorrow it caused, Louis XVI's execution made an awful sort of sense in the context of the French Revolution. So long as the monarch lived, schemes would continue to circulate to usurp him to the throne, and the fledgling constitutional republic would never be secure. However, it is challenging to argue that the execution of Marie Antoinette was equally required. Louis alone had been endowed with authority, not his queen. She was no longer capable of threatening the revolutionaries who were holding her captive with her strength. The act of public indignation more closely resembles the sham trial and execution of Marie Antoinette than an act of justice. Beyond the monarch, she was the most despised individual in France, irrespective of the veracity or lack thereof of evidence against her. The accusations directed towards her in the libels and public rumor mill were largely unfounded. Not even the most infamous misquote attributed to her, "Let them eat cake," which was allegedly her response when informed that the French were without bread. The execution of Marie Antoinette served as a symbolic offering to the revolution. Her blood would serve as an expiation, demonstrating that France was doomed to return. In your opinion, what is Marie Antoinette like? Did she genuinely face an inescapable fate, ensnared in historical conditions beyond her control? Did she squander chances to collaborate with reformers and contribute to the moderation of the revolution? Or were the demise of the French monarchy, the revolution's radicalization, and the advent of the terror all unavoidable outcomes? Kindly provide your thoughts in the designated comments section. Additionally, as always, I appreciate you viewing.